We begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded and shared. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and to the ongoing storytelling traditions of First Nations people across the many countries of this continent. Breda, welcome to Solid Yarns, a podcast about First Nations creatives and their practices. We're here to chat about how industry partners and First Nations creatives can best work together. Each episode, we'll hear from a First Nations creative and the client they worked with. We'll hear about the project they made, the challenges they faced, and the lessons they learned. On our first episode, you're hearing from me, Emrhan Tjapanangka Sultan. I'm a West Narrandera, Luritja and Cookatha man, creative artist, cultural consultant, and co-founder of Solid Lines. And you're hearing from Psembi Kinstan, Chief Creative Officer at the advertising agency DDB.
If you're working on a project and you know there's deep cultural meaning and weight behind it, again, you just have to go in with an open mind to what could happen. So many clients will come and say, hey, we want to have some First Nations inclusivity, and it often is a tick box.
Psembi and I worked on a project to create the first Aboriginal flag Genmoji for Apple. A Genmoji, for those who don't know, is custom emoji that you can create on the iPhone. The project focused on representation and protection of culture and raised important discussions on ICIP, Indigenous, cultural and intellectual property. This is episode 1 of Solid Yarns, developing design and creative industry knowledge around ICIP. Solid Lines was founded back in 2022 by myself, Nicholas St. John and Jeremy Wertzman of the Jackie Winter Group, but conversations really began a few years prior to that when Nicola went out to Hammondsburg, west of Alice Springs, and part of her studies was to work with school kids out in remote communities and teach them about creative design, about putting their traditional stories into digital formats and teaching them how to transfer those designs onto t-shirts and coffee mugs and being able to sell them at the local shops, and just showing them what type of opportunities there were within the creative design industry, but also acknowledging that there was really a missed space for a lot of artists who were in remote communities, really. So we saw that as a missed opportunity in that there weren't any Aboriginal-led agencies within the space that really offered that opportunity to these people within remote communities. Solid Lines quickly became more than just an agency. It became a space for cultural safety, creative mentoring, and education, especially around ICIP, or Indigenous, cultural and intellectual property. The more that we talked about it, we realised that there's really no conversations around what does cultural appropriation look like, because we see a lot of the Aboriginal artwork from the Central and Western Desert region being used all around the country without the proper understanding of what these stories represent to us traditionally. So a lot of those stories were being done by artists who weren't traditionally connected to the Central and Western Desert area. So we wanted a space where we could also talk about that, in a culturally safe way, but also help educate people around cultural appropriation, and that comes to the Indigenous, cultural, intellectual property, in how we protect our Aboriginal art and storytelling, our cultural heritage, in particular, that encompasses not only Aboriginal art, but, that looks at things like bush tucker, our songs and dances, anything that comes under cultural heritage is protected by the ICIP. So we wanted to have those conversations and educate people about what that was as well, and why it was important to incorporate that ICIP into the works that they're doing. The need for cultural safety isn't limited to artists. It extends to brands and agencies commissioning the work. The big one would be, don't assume that all Aboriginal art is the same. We have different law, we have different customs, we have different songs and dances, and connected to that is our storytelling through art. So I think that's something that a lot of the clients really need to learn more about, and we do a lot of talks with agencies around the country as well, particularly throughout Melbourne and Sydney areas, on how do these agencies brief Aboriginal artists and engage with clients when they want to engage with an artist to produce a piece of artwork. Then in 2024 came the opportunity to collaborate with DDB Design Agency to create the Aboriginal flag Genmoji. Genmojis are Apple's new tool to create your own emojis, something it introduced just recently.
Hi, I'm Psembi Kinstan. I'm the Chief Creative Officer of DDB. DDB is Australia's largest advertising network and one of the world's largest advertising networks. Why did we start this project? Well, actually it just happened really organically. One of the creatives in the team just asked the question one day. They were obviously probably putting something on their own social media. Maybe they weren't even looking for it, but they were scrolling through all of the flags and went, oh, there's no Aboriginal flag. Why is that?
Psembi and the DDB team reached out to Solid Lines. For us, the priority was respect for the flag, its creator, Harold Thomas, and the culture it represents. At the very beginning, when we were approached about the idea of an emoji for the Aboriginal flag, I really wanted to make sure that we ran it by Harold Thomas firstly, just as a courtesy to say, hey, this is what we're going to be doing, because he had created that design and that's something I'm really respectful of as well. So that was something that was at the very top of my list. The Aboriginal flag was created by Harold Thomas, a very proud Luritja man from Central Australia back in around about 1971. So it's something that symbolises Aboriginal people all around the country. The symbols of the red being the land that we walk on. You got the circle, which is the sun, the giver of life, and you got the black, which represents the people. It's something that's been with us for over 50 years now. When it comes to symbols, it's probably one of the most important symbols that identifies who we are as Aboriginal people all around the country. It highlights the struggles that we've had to have throughout generations, particularly when we talk about the stolen generation. There's lots of history that goes into what the Aboriginal flag represents.
If you're working on a project and you know there's deep cultural meaning and weight behind it, again, you just have to go in with an open mind to what could happen. And we never felt that we should be the owners of the project either. We've had an observation, we have this idea to slightly hack the Apple system to allow it. But if someone else would like to drive that and push that agenda, then we'll help kind of more from back end to make that possible. We're not the driver of this project, but we can be in the back seat allowing it technically to come to life.
We've been trying to get the Aboriginal flag as an emoji for so long now, and we just didn't have any success. We reached out to, and when I say we, the Aboriginal community reached out to the platforms that create the emojis, requesting something like the Aboriginal flag. So a lot of the responses that came back was the Aboriginal flag, even though it's a national flag of Australia, it was like we were just flat out denied the use of, having something that really symbolises who we are as a people. So, I think that was just another setback, but, we persevere and, we try and push on. And every time that the community pursued the idea of creating the flag as an emoji, we're kind of knocked back again. So I think when DDB came to us and told us about this new platform through Apple with the Genmoji, this is a really great tool where we thought, this is going to be a breakthrough for us because we are going to be able to create the Aboriginal flag. Now, there were certain things that we couldn't use, in terms of using the app to create the flag, so it wouldn't recognise words like flag. So there were certain ways of we had to describe, what to design. So that was a really big breakthrough for us, I think.
If you're on your iPhone or your Samsung phone or on Meta or Instagram or TikTok, if Unicode releases a new emoji, then it gets immediately adopted by all of those. In this instance, though, Apple are releasing Genmoji, which is their tool to say, we're going to let anyone create any emoji they like, except they'd ban the word flag, so they didn't want people to actively use it like we've used it in this instance. And we realised, when we heard about that was our opportunity to go, we can probably break their system to allow people to create the Aboriginal flag. And if we can do that on Apple, perhaps it'll actually cause enough momentum and attention to perhaps release it on all of the platforms. So if you have an iPhone, you can go in to write a text message and you can click on the emoji button, and at the top right, it'll say Genmoji, and you can use that Genmoji to create a prompt to create anything you like. Now, we had to trial dozens, or I think over 100 in the end, slight variations of language because they didn't want anyone to create flags. So of course you can go, hey, it's a rectangle or it's a wavy rectangle. So the prompt is, and this was discovered after lots of trial and error, but it's very straightforward, a wavy black and red rectangle with a medium-sized yellow circle in the middle. Super simple, but we found in kind of dozens of small variations of that made quite a profound difference. And actually from one user to the next, that same prompt will generate different images. That set of words is the one that we felt was most consistent. So from my phone to your phone to Joe Bloggs' phone, it's most likely to show up with an accurate representation of the flag.
I think their motivation was that they understood that we've been trying for so long to be able to get the Aboriginal flag as an emoji without any success. And this was a way around creating the emoji. Their motivation was respectful in a way that, that they approached us really respectfully. And I think their main thing was to support the Aboriginal community in creating the flag as an emoji.
The audience of the campaign immediately obvious is, okay, this is a flag that's going to be used most by the community, but we all can be proud of that flag and we all have access to it, and we all should feel the ability to use it and to celebrate it as Australians in a respectful way, of course, like you would with any flag. So primarily it's for the community, but I think every single Australian can find and should be proud of some parts of Australia's history and incredible First Nations history. So if you're out on January 26th at a protest, or you're going to some community event, and you're, posting about the amazing welcome to country you've just heard, or why wouldn't you have access to this emoji like you would, again, 256 other emojis that you can use?
To be able to have a symbol like the Aboriginal flag that identifies who we are as a people of this country, what it represents to us. It highlights our story, our history within this country. I think it's something that people should be proud of. We're the oldest living continuous culture on Earth, and why not celebrate that? And I think this would be a great way of honouring that. The collaboration with DDB and Subtle Lines, we believe, set a high standard for working with First Nations creatives. DDB was open to listening, learning and collaborating throughout the project, and respecting ICIP, Indigenous, cultural and intellectual property.
As you can imagine, there's so much you'd learn along this process. Probably the first bit of really big new news to me, just how important it is to obviously engage with Harold Thomas, the creator of the Aboriginal flag, and how to make sure that we respect his creation of it and his kind of moral rights to still own that morally. So that was the first piece. The second piece was then actually how the different artists around the country then built further meaning into it by sharing their artworks kind of sitting behind the emoji, and their stories around representation that they then told in media, but then through their art as well, was just really fascinating and interesting, as you can imagine.
So I don't think there's any harm in people asking for help. I think it's all about that education process as well, and it goes back to my art practice of educating people about my culture. And I want the best for all Aboriginal cultures around the country to really achieve something that they can be proud of. In creating their own brand rather than relying on other mobs' styles. It all comes back to conversations for me. I like to have conversations with clients about what they can do when briefing artists, what it is that they need to be mindful of as well. The big one would be, don't assume that all Aboriginal art is the same. I think that's probably the most single important thing that clients can really take away from this conversation is knowing where the artist comes from and having a better understanding about the type of artwork that comes from that particular area. So I think it's really important for conversations to be had, talking about what is cultural appropriation, why does ICIP really matter, what does it mean for Aboriginal artists, and what can agencies and non-Aboriginal people do to better support the outcome of achieving that.
My advice to businesses and especially agencies, so many clients will come and say, hey, we want to talk about or have some First Nations inclusivity, and it often is a tick box. And the first thing to do, and I think where it gets so interesting and your job becomes so much more exciting, is just ask Cody, what are you trying to achieve, or why is that? Because if the answer is, hey, we'd like to support this particular artist or a community, or we'd like to make meaningful change, then maybe the brief that they give you isn't the right brief. You can interrogate and you go, okay, well, if you as a business want to help a community, then let's be open to the answer not just being doing one artwork and some money, transfer of money. Let's go, okay, what's more meaningful? Let's just start a dialogue and let's not know where that conversation is going to go. But let's be clear that perhaps what you're trying to achieve isn't just giving someone some money and then kind of like, yeah, we're done with it. It's actually trying to make some impact. So forget the normal response, go after where there's impact.
I think the main challenge was getting those platforms to identify the Aboriginal flag as an emoji, or should be an emoji, this is a symbol of our people. It's a national flag of the country, and when we open up the app with all the flags, you've got the national flags on there. Why isn't the Aboriginal flag on there? I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that's come out of this. We also need to use this as a way to put more pressure on those platforms to say, hey, we're here, we want to be seen, and we want to be heard.
So it's interesting because in some ways this has been successful, as in we've allowed lots of Australians to have access to the emoji, or we've helped them. But it really isn't a success yet in my mind, because the only and the most meaningful outcome we can get to here is that Unicode finally unlocks the Aboriginal flag emoji for everyone all around the world. So that's what we're hoping to achieve. But this is something that we can keep talking about and sharing, and the more people use it and share it, the more that there'll continue to be some momentum, and perhaps in the future we can actually unlock it and Unicode will approve it.
So I think it's always been about disrupting, the platforms that haven't allowed us to have this type of voice on social media in particular. So because Genmoji is an Apple product, it is only available on Apple. It is a start, and I think this is a really good way of putting more pressure on those platforms to say, hey, the feedback that we've got has been absolutely massive. We want to show that to these platforms and say, this is what you could be doing. You've been listening to me, Emrhan Tjapanangka Sultan. I'm one of the co-founders of Solid Lines Design Agency, and Psembi Kinstan, Chief Creative Officer at DDB Melbourne. If you want to add the Aboriginal flag emoji to your phone, you need an iPhone running iOS 18.2 or higher. Open the keyboard, select the emoji icon, then Genmoji, and enter the description with these words: a black and red rectangle with a medium-sized yellow circle in the middle. Now you can add the Aboriginal flag into your text, and hopefully one day the Aboriginal flag will take its rightful place as an official flag emoji approved by Unicode. On the next episode, we hear about a project that Solid Lines did with Australia Post. The project raised important questions about the diversity of First Nations art and how clients should brief First Nations creatives.
Respect feels like, just giving me flexibility and feeling like my artwork, my opinion based off of my profession is valued, not just like, nitpicking and saying, telling me to create a pink rabbit. And when I go away and create a pink rabbit, they want a red dragon.
Working with First Nations, we always come from an angle of understanding and curiosity. So rather than dictating everything at the beginning, it was more of a collaborative approach where we want to work with the diversity of artists. Can we please have a discussion or chat about where do you think would work, or which artist would you think would work in which state?
That's next up on Solid Yarns. This podcast was produced by Nicholas St. John, Janik Rogers and Kimberly Lee at RMIT University in Naarm, Melbourne. Music by James Howard. Original music commissioned by Australian Dance Theatre for the Third. Choreographed by Artistic Director Daniel Riley. This program was made possible with support from the Alistair Swain Foundation. Find out more at alistair-swainfoundation.org.